especially to give every side of the story, because there are certain issues, let's call it this way, in conservation and in nature that are so complex. There is no way that you can get one person and that's going to be a full view.
Welcome to Wild Development Studio. Join us as we venture into the breathtaking realm of wildlife arts and untamed adventures. With captivating stories from the field and ideas to dive into the visual arts, we'll ignite your passion for conservation. Get ready to develop something wild.
Welcome to Wild Developments. I'm your guide, Lauren. Today we are thrilled to have Tommy Serafinski, an outdoorsman, podcaster, and speaker, on the show today. On Tommy's Outdoors, he delves into the natural environment, biodiversity, conservation, hunting and fishing, rewilding, and more. Tommy is passionate about wildlife and human-wildlife interactions, enjoying scientific research and first-hand outdoor experiences. He offers services such as public speaking, workshops, panel discussions, and engaging video content covering topics like climate change, biodiversity, and effective communication for scientists and environmentalists. With years of experience as a podcast host, Tommy converses with world-class scientists and experts in the natural sciences and conservation fields. His extensive reading and first-hand experiences have equipped him with unique perspectives on our relationship with nature. Tommy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I want to learn a little bit about your background because I have a hypothesis that us naturalists, like you and I, that we just have had a love for nature from a very young age. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Ooh, I might kind of make you to do the corrections of that idea. So I'm saying I'm a city boy, born and bred and born and raised in city boy in Poland. And you know, I grew up in a big city, and then after finishing university, I moved to another big city, Warsaw. And so I was surrounded by concrete and buildings and all that, you know, stuff. But we did have something that we called summer house, and that was like a little house that was really not suitable for Polish winters, at least back in the day, Polish winters. But we were there usually 2 to 3 months in the summer, and that was like in a rural area. So I pretty much enjoyed walking in the woods because there were, you know, a little bit of the woods around, and playing on the grass, not on the concrete and stuff like that. So that was really my background. And as I was growing up, I take a little bit on fishing, like angling. I started doing this, and you know, but I think that, so I always had that interest. It was always like a change of scenery, but only when this pushing 20 years now, I moved to Ireland, to the west coast of Ireland. And here's like very much rural area where I live in County Kerry. Well, Ireland mostly is rural anyway. And yeah, and that took off. It's like, wow, look at all these opportunities, you know, all these mountains here and the ocean here and all that. And so I gone crazy like that.
So you kind of proved me wrong. I thought maybe you were outside out in nature all the time. So city boy. So
City boy.
what made you decide to, like, how did you arrive to Tommy Outdoors?
There are two parts to this question. So first, you know, why podcast, and you know, about the subject of the podcast. So I had a blog in Polish language when I was still in Poland. I had a blog in Polish language when I was basically reporting and logging on my fishing adventures, my angling adventures. And so I was doing this thing, and you know, I had like, you know, they were like back in the day when actually organic growth was the thing. And you know, at some point Google was listing my blog at the first position. When you type River Shannon, like in Polish, it was going like a first position in Google, right? Completely organic. I've done nothing. It was just back in the day, right? The internet worked differently. And So then I moved to Ireland and I started, all these new opportunities, new species of fish, newer fishing. So I was doing this blog a lot, entries there, a lot of stuff were happening. And then after a while, it kind of dried out, and it dried out because I never, I wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna publish every week or I'm gonna publish every month. It was I literally had a header on the blog saying like posts are random depending whether something interesting happened. Because I didn't want to post like, oh, I was fishing, right? And then the next one, oh, I was fishing today again. I caught bass, right? And you have this picture, there's a guy with a fish, and you don't even know whether it's the same photo or maybe different photo. So I didn't want that. So there's only so many things that you can do. And I kind of like, was posting very seldom at some point. And also because I was in Ireland and I had like all the friends here, I thought that it would be good to do something in English. So, basically have a wider audience, and a lot of my Polish readers, subscribers, whatever it's called when you have a blog, would still can access my English content, but I just wanted to do something for people I was, knew who were around me because I was in this new place. But obviously, English not being your first language, it is way easier to speak than to write. And that's how the idea of podcast came in. Like, hey, there's this thing called podcasts. So you basically, again, good old days, you just, hit the record button and you do. So that's how I started doing podcasts. And so current, like back then, if you told me that I'm going to be like speaking with the world-class scientists and interviewing research teams who are doing some research and publishing papers, I would never believe that, because my idea was basically, I'm going to just hang out with my fishing buddies and we're going to talk about fish that we caught and whatever. So that was the idea of the podcast. And the first episodes that I probably don't want anyone to listen to are a little bit like that. And then at some point, it always interested me from the perspective of complexity of issues related to conservation and human wildlife conflict or human wildlife interactions, and things that supposedly be obvious, like, oh, everybody wants to protect nature, and then it turns out like, oh, it's not that easy. There are people who have different ideas, and that complexity really interested me. And from really from guest to guest, I started, to interviewing scientists, and, the one and another. And then people who are in charge of scientific projects were coming to me and saying, hey, I heard you recorded this podcast. We have an interesting scientist. And that kind of like took off, right? And obviously people were also more interested in that than, me talking about that we caught fish with our friends. And so that's how that transformation turned out. And that's where I kind of rebranded from Tommy's Outdoors. Now it's Tommy's Outdoors Conservation and Science, because that is the main focus to discuss issues related to ecology, conservation, human wildlife conflict, and especially to give every side of the story, because there are certain issues, let's call it this way, in conservation and in nature that are so complex. There is no way that you can get one person and that's going to be a full view. It's always going to be different stories, right? And I also often given that example that I had an episode about seals in Ireland, right? And the conflict with seals. And I had a lady from Seal Rescue Ireland, and very emotional language. Every animal deserves a second chance, and and then I had a trawler man who's losing money, right? And his attitude was like, shoot them. And then I had a scientist who are, gluing GPS tags to seals, and they're tracking them, and they really can see what they're doing and all that. Again, very factual language, very, matter of fact. So now I think that only when you see the issue from all these sides, then, and I'm not trying to convince anyone what's right, what's wrong. I have my own opinions, of course, like everybody else, but it's not like I'm promoting one or another point of view in a podcast. It's like, hey, you people are intelligent. You can listen to all those points of view and you can make up your mind. And surely, some people will think that, some people think something else. but they will be better informed. And that is the main thing. And from the very beginning, I was saying like, hey, if after listening to my podcast, even one person goes like, oh, I never thought about that. Well, my job is done. Like, I'm already happy. So that's how it, that's, I'm probably rambling now, starting from your question, but that's how it started from, city boy going fishing in the pond and then putting photos of the fish they caught in the blog, to now conservation and science podcast where I'm interviewing these incredibly interesting people.
That's really interesting that you're getting all sides. And I love that because you don't know what the fisherman maybe is going through. Because, they're after the same thing. And you have other people that just have a bleeding heart for these cute animals. So we do need to hear all sides of it and somehow try and figure out a way to meet in the middle and all coexist. So that's a great takeaway message from your podcast. Now, is this your full-time job or do you do something else?
No, I'm working in the computer industry my day, and this is sort of my alter ego, if you like a like
a passion project.
It's a passion project. It's a labor of love. Like one of the guests called it's a complicated hobby.
Well, I think it's great. And you've got over 170 episodes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. 173 is dropping next week. While we're recording that, by the time it goes like, it's going to be probably 180 something.
Yeah. So this is going to be kind of a trick question because
bring it on.
I know my answer to this. What has been your favorite guest?
My favorite guest. I don't think it would be fair to pick one, because then someone's gonna listen to, oh, you didn't like me. So I don't think I have a favorite guest. There were some memorable guests, I would put it that way. And I may be gonna flip that question around a little bit and answer this way. I would, if not the podcast, I would never have an opportunity to speak with people I'm speaking with on the record, right? Let's take polar bear research or wolf conflict with wolves policy or anything like that, right? And you have this expert. I couldn't just call him up and say like, hey, are you gonna talk to me for an hour about polar bears, right? The dude was like, whoa, what a weirdo, right?
Yeah.
But now I'm coming like, oh, hey, I'm gonna produce this podcast, and I think there's a lot of interesting information, and people go like, yeah, okay, let's do this. And so I, to some extent, and now answer your question. So to some extent, every single guest is my favorite guest because I have opportunity to learn, and through me learning by speaking with them and asking questions, hopefully other people also learning and finding new information and getting more informed. So I would put it that way. I don't think really it would be fair and honest to pick one, because every person is different. Every person has their own personalities. Every person has a different point of view, and they're doing different things. So it's hard to say. But I feel privileged every time I am recording a podcast. I feel privileged right now speaking with you, because again, this is like we're learning something, and we have this conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to say that every guest is my favorite guest because I learned something completely new from every single person I have on. And like you said, you wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity to talk to that person because you'd be like, why does this weirdo want to talk to me? And I love getting to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is nature. So okay, adults don't talk about this, but what is your favorite animal?
Oh, my favorite animal depends on the day. It's again one of those difficult questions. I say like Wolverine. Well, but I never seen a Wolverine in my life, right? Maybe something that I am more, see more often. Sika deer, which is very, I think misunderstood, and it's like treated as an invasive species in Ireland. They come from Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't have like a favorite anything. Because for me, life is just how many things you experience. It's just a collection of experiences, and saying like, oh, this is the best one is like tells me that you probably didn't experience much else and everything. It's hard to, you know, how can you compare fish with mammals, with
Hmm.
birds, with invertebrates, with like, ooh, it's a tough one. I'm gonna dodge that one, Lauren.
Okay, that's fair enough. Now you do some public speaking too, right?
Hmm.
What are some of the topics that you speak on?
Yeah, so maybe most interesting topics. One of them was really like not so much public speaking, but it was a panel discussion on consumption of meat. So the question was whether it's possible to still consume meat and have both climate and animal welfare at the forefront of your mind. And that was interesting because I came from the perspective of a hunter, saying like, hey, I'm not suggesting that this is societal solution, because of the society we need many different solutions. We need a collection of solutions. It's like no one size fits all. But if you have an opportunity, you can actually procure or harvest your own meat by going hunting. And at the same time, being where I am in Ireland, actually the talk was in Great Britain, in the UK. So same thing, uh, because we don't have any natural predators. Wild ungulates, deer are essentially we rely there's the reliance on hunters to reduce the numbers, because otherwise, and everything that goes into that, damage to forestry, damage to crops, destruction of biodiversity as well, because if the overabundant species basically eats everything, then the vegetation collapses and biodiversity suffers. So my point was like, hey, if you have that opportunity, you can get your own meat, and that way you are in charge of animal welfare, depending how good shot you are. And at the same time, you're actually helping biodiversity and you're helping nature. And you can have like a best possible nutrient dense, clean, lean meat. So that is one option that I'm suggesting. And um, after the event, the organizers said that they were a little bit worried about me, like given the people who are coming in there, and like this guy comes and say, you only hunt deer. But surprisingly, that wasn't controversial at all. More of a discussion picked up on like, oh, should we ban meat? So it was like focused on really there's no good solution, because you have a social inequalities, and so, oh, you need to consume less meat but better quality. But then the argument is like, yes, but poor people won't be able to afford that meat, so this is fundamentally classist, so we need to have a cheap meat. But when you have a cheap meat, then the production of it is an animal welfare disaster and environmental disaster, etc., etc. So that's when the conversation went in. So, and then another subject that I surprisingly to myself speak quite often is about climate change and connection between climate change and biodiversity. And I am just surprised how many otherwise intelligent and well-educated people are still kind of like a poking on the like borderline climate denial ideas. And I always come to this with genuine approach to answer the question, right? Because like if someone says like, oh, is the climate change really man-made, right? If you go like, oh, you're stupid, educate yourself, you're not getting there, right? This is the opposite what you should do. So even if I am disappointed because I think that in 2024 the discussion about climate change should move on, and there is a lot of things to discuss, and there is a lot of questions, and there is a lot of still unknowns. But I think that we should be already past the like, oh, CO2 is food for plants, it's all good, right? We should be already have that behind us and sorted this out. So when the people are still coming with those arguments, I feel like you have to appreciate the question and approach this with like, okay, I'm gonna approach this in a good faith and try to answer that question best to my ability, not dismissing the question, even though I might think that the question was already answered. So that's again something. And there is, I think that, what's the word I'm looking for? I think that the people becoming more conscious of the problems that are happening because of the climate change. So there is a more and more need, and there's like, we are like naturalists, we are like in it, right? We see what's going on. But like people who are just like, I'm working in the computer industry, people in computers like, oh, whatever, right? And maybe, yeah, I know there's a climate change, right? But then there are regulations coming in now. The companies needs to report on their CO2 emissions, like, so this thing is becoming really, really mainstream, and I think there is a lot of need for people, going in and explaining things again, because I think this is the pitfall, that we thought that everything was already discussed, everything was already figured out, and if someone asks the question like, is there really climate change, is it human made, right, then straight away they're deniers, and I'm not going to spend time on them. Like, no, we need to spend the time explaining 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 times what's going on and why, what is the evidence for that.
I really feel like if people that are in the computer industry, let's say, they're going every day to their office and they don't see maybe something. Let's take ocean pollution, for example. Like, unless you go to a beach and there is animals stuck in like maybe fishing line, or you just see the trash everywhere, you're gonna be blind to that, and you're like, oh gosh, why are these regulations coming down? Why does this affect me? I don't understand. Like, we need to, like you were talking about earlier, have these shared stories and get the word out, and then then people will care. If they don't see it, they're never gonna care.
Exactly.
And like, all it takes is on a summer day in the city, you're not going to be out on the concrete. You're going to want to be in a green space. We need more green spaces.
Yeah. But, even things that, like, if you look at, I don't know, like how it is where you live, but in Europe, I think it's most in Europe, certainly in Poland and certainly in Ireland, you see what's happening to the olive oil. Like, olive oil, like either certain brands disappearing, or the brands that are still on, the bottles are getting smaller, but the price is still the same, and they're harder to come by. Why? Because the places where olives grew, they are turning into a desert, literally. So it's gonna be less and less. So at least, like, hey, do you know, like, why this happened? This is not because of some conspiracy, some olive oil drinking lizard people. It's because it's there's an actual problem with growing the plants, right? I was talking with the owner of a vineyard in the UK, and they had to close down that vineyard because of the climate change, right? And you may say, like, how like vineyard because of the climate change in the UK? We heard that argument, right? That in the medieval warm period, there were vineyards in the UK, right? So climate is getting better and it's only coming back to what it was. Like, no. So what turns out is, like, it is not so much that the climate is getting warmer, because that in itself would be okay for vines. The problem is that there is usually around, I'm probably gonna butcher this now, but I think it's around March, there's still freeze. There still can be temperatures below 0, right? And then when the vines are still in the ground, they're very resilient to that. They can survive all the freeze, and then they start growing. The problem with climate change is that it's getting warmer much earlier, and those vines are starting to get out of the soil, But then comes the freeze,
Mm.
and they're all gone, right? So it's a combination. So sometimes it's like counterintuitive. You would say, "Oh, climate is warmer, then the vineyards should flourish in the UK." No, not true, because you still have a freeze early in the year, and if those vines start growing earlier, they just been gonna freeze out, and that's nothing, right? And what is the solution? Well, the solution is you can fly a helicopter over the vineyard that draws the warm air onto them. Like, oh, that's great, right? We have a problem with climate change and with all the emissions, so now we're gonna fly helicopters over the vineyards to make them a little bit warmer, right? So you think about this like, oh my god, like what is going on? And people don't know these things. People just don't know. So I think it's very interesting to talk about those things.
That sounds very interesting. Gosh, do you do talks like that often?
Not nearly as often. I have my full-time job, which I like very much. I do my podcast. I'm occasionally writing blogs. Outside of that, I have like a normal life, and I'm also trying to go hunting and fishing and actually be outdoors. One of the things about Tommy's Outdoors is that I'm less time outdoors and more time in front of a computer. So that's the problem. Yeah, not nearly as often as I would like to, but I'm also kind of picky, just to balance everything out. You have only 24 hours in a day, and you need to spend like 7 to 8 sleeping, and then you eat, and then you need to work for 8 hours. So there's very little time in the day.
Yeah. I hear you there. I had that thought the other day. I'm like, I'm loving interviewing all these people, but then I'm like, I could be outside doing
100%.
So what's your 5-year goal with the podcast? And do you have a dream guest that you want to have on the show?
Not anymore. Not anymore. About the dream guest. I used to have like a celebrities from the industry, and I would love to. But then that thing with it's very boring, because like the thing is, like, those celebrities, when they're going on a podcast, they usually have either film coming or book coming or something, and they're like everywhere, every single podcast. They're gonna say yes almost every opportunity, and that is precisely the moment where you don't want to talk to them, because they're everywhere. So I think I'm more focused on environmental issues rather than people. So like I had a podcast coming about European Union trying to put Sika deer on the invasive alien species list, and what that might mean to Ireland, for Ireland. And as you know, I recorded an episode about the EU proposal to lower protection status of wolves. So again, when the topic is kind of hot, then I want to cover that topic as well. And not even from the perspective is like, oh sure, right, this is great for listenership and for downloads and what have you, because everybody's, but it's actually not what drives me. What drives me is to inform people, because like with this situation, like with wolves, for example, that's a good example, right? You basically have like a very polarized view, right? On one hand, you have like, oh, they now want to shoot all the wolves. And on the other hand, like, now they value wolves more than us, and the wolves are the worst thing ever, right? The school gonna close, and the priest gonna leave, and everything will go, And it's like, no, it's neither of these things. Let's talk about what that really is, what that really might mean. And this is what kind of drives me to like counteract a little bit of these kind of like extremely polarized mainstream narratives, and present how that thing really look like. Because when you look at those things, they're really complex, and they're seldom simple. They're seldom can be encapsulated in a soundbite or in one header. it's complex, it's complicated. There are many different nuances and points of view, and it's interesting, and I think that people should know about it. And this is important to counteract this clickbaity, hey, I know everything about this from this 280 characters, and then I'm moving on to the next thing. So, and to touch to your first part of the question, like what is the plan for 5 years, I would love to be like this go-to place when people have like, oh, this is happens again. Yeah, I'm gonna listen to Tommy on Conservation and Science podcast, because that is where I can get every point of view or multiple points of view and actually make my own mind. I think that people are not spending enough time on making up their own mind, and rather want something to be given to them. And then obviously there's a lot of people who are very willing to give them opinions, and that we shouldn't do that. We should always think about it and learn, gather information, and figure out stuff ourselves.
Have you ever done like a forum during your podcast where you've had both sides of an issue?
Not on one episode. I've done that, but I record those separately. And there is like being like so many years in computer industry in the corporate, I think I could moderate and deal with that no problem. So I'm not worried about that. I don't want those people. I put it like I could handle that. I'm not sure if my guests could handle that. And then they will get confrontational. Yeah. And when you get confrontational, and when you get emotions are high, you tend to say stupid things. And when you say stupid things, you might unwillingly dismiss your own point of view. So that's what I prefer. Speak with every person separately, poke them a little bit, just ask uncomfortable questions. I'm all for asking uncomfortable questions, but let them be able to fully articulate the answers, and then present that and say, hey, this is similar question, or this is similar question, here are the answers. So I do that. I'm gonna do this more because I think it's a better format. So like, for example, the example I gave you about seals, right? There were like 3 different episodes. So and between them was something else. So people need to listen to 3 different episodes. Not many people will do that. So I'm doing that now, combining into one episode, at least trying to, it's much more work, because essentially if you have 3 guests in one episode, it goes as much work as for 3 episodes. So that's another thing, that. But that's definitely direction I'm going to be taking my podcast more often, to present different views, but on one episode.
That's fantastic. I can't wait to hear more in the future of your podcast. Where can people find you?
Well, every podcasting app, including YouTube, like YouTube is also podcasting app these days, apparently. Tommy's Outdoors, Conservation and Science, or just Conservation and Science. You see the logo, a man in a hat and sunglasses. That's me. So Tommy's Outdoors, Conservation and Science. Also tommysoutdoors.com. Whichever, like any search engine, whether it's YouTube, Google, or Spotify, Apple, you'll find me there. And from there, you can always find all the links to social media, website, etc., etc.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And until next time, get outside and see what develops.
Thanks for joining Wild Development Studio. We hope this exploration into the world of wildlife arts and adventure has sparked a desire to get outside and connect with something wild. If you have an adventure that's awe-inspiring, don't hesitate to share. Click the link in the description to submit your story to have it featured on our show or be a guest. Until next time, keep connecting to the wild and see what develops. The views, opinions, and statements expressed by individuals during Wild Development Studio productions do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Wild Development Studio or its affiliates. Participation in any activities, expeditions, or adventures discussed or promoted during our content may involve inherent risks. It is strongly advised that individuals conduct thorough research, seek professional guidance, and take all necessary precautions before engaging in any such activities. Wild Development Studio, its representatives, or employees shall not be held responsible for any injury, loss, damage, accident, or unforeseen incident that may occur as a result of participating in activities inspired by or discussed in our content. By choosing to engage with our content or act upon any information provided, individuals do so at their own risk and discretion.